Hello and welcome to my latest video, which is for GCSE Citizenship Studies, and this video is looking at the role of the media and the free press. Okay, so I think the first thing to say is that as a democracy, one of the most important things that we value is having a free press and media. In other words, this is essentially our ability to access lots of different sources of information, whether that's on TV, radio, newspapers, the internet, etc., without censorship or interference by the government or other organisations. And we're going to look in this video as to why that might be considered really important. Right, so one of the questions that we may have is, does that mean you can publish whatever you like? And the answer is, in this country, and I should say that rules apply differently in different countries, is no, not really. In the first place, if you publish something, it has to be factually correct, or you run the risk of being sued for something called defamation. Now, defamation takes two forms. It can be libel, which is where the comments are written down, or slander, where they're spoken. So what's an example of this? Perhaps, I don't know, you're in school and a teacher accuses you of stealing something and then publishes that information on the school website. They name you and say that you have stolen something. Now, you're able to prove that you haven't stolen something, but you are also quite upset the fact that your name has been put on the internet and you've been accused of this. Well, theoretically, you could take the teacher to court and sue them for libel. The difficulty is that actually the court are probably not going to award you very much money. The other thing is it's going to be a very expensive process to do. One of the examples which I've given there is the actor Johnny Depp, who took the Sun to court over a story that accused him of being a wife beater. He denied that claim and said that his reputation had been damaged by the Sun. Unfortunately for Depp, he lost the case, and as a result of that had to pay the legal fees of the newspaper, which amounted to £628,000. So you can see that it's a really costly business. There are also cases where individuals or the government may also ask that the courts stop things being published if they believe it's sensitive information. And you sometimes hear about those. They're called injunctions. It's basically where someone will go to a court and say, look, I really don't want this information published. It will have a detrimental impact on my life. Can you provide a court order to stop that? Now, in some ways, there's quite a bit of difficulty with that, but we'll go into that a bit later. Okay, so one of the things that we might want to look at is whether something is in the public interest. That generally is the test as to why something would be published in the media. Now, why does it have to be in the public interest? Well, one human right that you enjoy is the right to a private and family life. This means that stories, particularly in the mass media, have to be in the public interest. In other words, they need to be something that the public might need to know, or it's important for them to know about. This is sometimes a bit of a difficult balancing act. You can imagine that the newspapers may want to publish something which they believe is in the public interest, which a lot of people may turn around and say, well, no, it's not in the public interest at all. Again, an example of this is the love life of celebrities, something which appears in the newspaper quite often. So one of the questions you might want to ask is it in the public interest if a celebrity is having an affair when that doesn't apply to your next door neighbour? What's the difference? Surely both have the right to a private and family life. So why is it okay to print a story which has a celebrity featured in it, but not your next door neighbour? I guess the chances are that most people will not know your next door neighbour unless you live next to someone who's particularly famous, whereas a celebrity is someone who might appear on TV and may well have I don't know, talked about sort of what particular moral values, or talked about the fact that they're happily married, etc. And it could all be a bit of a lie. Anyway, it's something for you to consider. The next area is impartiality. So one of the things that we need to be aware of is how impartial the media actually is. Very often we see stuff on TV, read stuff, etc., whether that's on the internet, in a book, whatever it might be, take it in and regard it as being factually correct. Well, that might be correct, it might be based on facts, but is someone putting a spin on it to make it appear good or bad? And so one of the questions you might want to consider is the information you receive or we receive biased? It's a bit of a complicated picture. For some organisations, such as the BBC, they're required by law, they have a charter which requires them to be impartial. Now, that's basically because the BBC play quite a significant role in society. You know, they're one of the big sort of 4 or 5, TV channels, and so a lot of people rely on the information that the BBC provides, and because of that reliance on that information, they would expect them to be impartial. So that basically means that the BBC are required to treat particularly political stories, they're required to treat them fairly. They can, for example, criticise the government and explain why the government's criticised, but at the same time they've also got to explain, any defence that the government may have for whatever their actions are. Which leads us on to newspapers. Unlike the BBC, newspapers don't have to be impartial. Now, the BBC gets their funding from the public, whereas newspapers, they appeal. They still get their money from the public. That's a bit confusing. But basically, you can choose not to. You can choose to buy a newspaper or not to buy a newspaper. You can choose whichever newspaper you want or don't want, slightly differently with the BBC. Although they're still required to be factual, they can and do give their opinion. And you can look at examples of that. For example, the Daily Mail and the Sun support the Conservative Party, whilst the Daily Mirror and Guardian support the Labour Party. Now, how can you see this kind of, if you like, it's not exactly bias. How can you see that being played out? Well, when you see stories about COVID, you'll see that the BBC is being quite balanced about how the government have dealt with the COVID crisis. In the case of newspapers, not necessarily the case. They're very often criticising government ministers, etc., and telling them that they're doing a good job or a bad job, etc. So people's opinion reading different newspapers can be quite polarised. Some newspapers treat Boris Johnson as being the greatest thing since sliced bread, and some newspapers will treat him as a kind of, blundering idiot. So I guess, as I say, be aware of that lack of impartiality within newspapers. One of the last big topics that I'm going to talk about is social media and the internet. And it's fair to say that social media and the internet have changed the kind of landscape considerably over the last few years. In the past, we've talked about the traditional mass media, things like TV, radio, newspapers, etc. Now, newspapers have been around for a couple of 100 years, the radio 100 years or so, and TV is heading towards its 100th anniversary. Social media and the internet are a recent phenomena, and they raise new issues such as fake news. Everyone, for example, can now be a publisher. I'm producing this video and telling you that this is what you need to know for your citizenship GCSE. Well, the question might be, how do you know? I'm publishing it on YouTube. YouTube, as a media source, is only 16 years old. It's as old as some of you, and yet it has 2 billion users. So there are a lot of criticisms of social media and the internet. For example, it's very difficult to regulate. It's also been criticised for lack of control over things like racism, homophobia, etc. So it allows views which are quite harmful to be expressed and presented as being fairly normal. You've also got, as I say, fake news, and we've come across that with stories about COVID and vaccines and things like that. Social media and the internet also has no international boundaries, so it's very difficult to control it in the way that we might control traditional forms of media. And that's a concern to countries such as North Korea, who would prefer their people to remain isolated from the outside world. Again, how do you regulate that? It's pretty difficult to do. Okay, so hopefully this fairly short video will give you a bit of an overview of the media and the free press, and in the next video what we'll be looking at is press regulation.